What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Untangling Climate Finance. I'm Jay Tipton. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to read a review that was left from a listener on Apple Podcast. This one comes from A. Rodriguez A. He, or she, I'm not really sure, says, "It's nice to finally have a podcast that covers topics that are relevant and important. Big fan of the host and the guests so far. A must listen for anybody who cares about the climate." Hey, thanks for the compliments, A. Rodriguez A. That was a box office review, and I sincerely appreciate it. Now, let's get back to the regularly scheduled program. In this episode, I'll be talking with David Antonioli. For those of you who work inside the carbon market space, David is a household name thanks to his time served as the founding CEO of the American Standard and Registry, Verra. David led Verra for almost 15 years before stepping down earlier this year in May. Under his guidance, the nonprofit grew into the world's largest carbon credit certifier. During his time, Verra established standards that are currently in use by the private sector, governments, and civil society to generate climate finance. Beyond Verra's growth, David has played a key role in advancing the overall voluntary carbon market, which has had one heck of a year, including both ups and downs. On the downside, there have been a handful of articles and reports exposing major problems like overcrediting, human rights issues, revenue sharing, and even calling into question the efficacy of the market in general. At the same time, groups like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, or the ICVCM, and the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, or VCMI, have been hard at work to fix many of these issues and prepare the VCM for a new and improved future. David and I touch on a lot of this in our chat, and thanks to his experience, he is a vital source of knowledge and expertise. So needless to say, he shares a lot of great insights. But enough from me, let's hear from David. Hi, David. Welcome to Untangling Climate Finance. I appreciate you joining me. How are you doing today?
Great. Nice to talk to you, Jay, and thanks for the invitation to be here.
Absolutely. So why don't we kick the episode off by, just telling me a little bit about yourself?
Most people will know me from being the CEO of Verra for 15 years. Before that, I've basically been doing work on climate change for about 30 years now, and I've been at it from very different angles. I've been an environmental activist. I've worked under the Montreal Protocol as a consultant, and I've worked in the private sector. I've worked for governments, and then I've worked for Verra as an NGO, standard setter for many years, and now I'm an independent contractor. I decided to pass the reins on at Verra to the team. And now I'm looking forward to seeing what the next chapter is and what else I can contribute with.
Perfect. And I always like to hear a little bit of the personal side of the stories. As you said, you've been working in climate change for about 15 years now. What was it that brought you into this space?
Yeah, I say it's more like 30 years. But, it's actually kind of a interesting story. I was a consultant working for ICF Consulting back in the day, and I was recruited to help a colleague of mine develop projects that provided recovery and recycling technology to mobile air conditioning shops around the world. This was under the Ozone Treaty. And then part of my job at ICF, very small job, when I actually worked for Craig Ebert. Craig Ebert was my boss, who's now the CEO and president of the Climate Action Reserve. And one of my jobs was to help developing countries in Latin America in particular, develop their greenhouse gas inventories. And so I was actually born and raised in Mexico for 15 years and speak Spanish fluently and fully bicultural. And so that was kind of my entry point to climate change. And, very early on, I realized this is a pretty big issue that is not getting the attention that we need. And so I kind of have built my career around it. And I think, speaking from the personal perspective, another thing that's always weighed heavily on my mind is the level of development, throughout Latin America, of course, Africa and Asia as well. And so when I studied a graduate degree, I got a degree in environmental policy, but also in international development, which I think is really critical. And I think with climate change and carbon markets, you can see those two blended in a really powerful way.
Absolutely. Interesting too, because, one, I didn't know you were from Mexico or you were born and raised there. That's an interesting mystery that I just discovered, but that was kind of my idea into it as well when I started really paying attention to climate change. Of course, I was focused on what was happening in the US because that's where I'm from, but I was really thinking about Latin America and Africa. And so we share that same interest and background, I think, in terms of really thinking about the problem. But do you still spend time in Mexico?
Oh yeah. My mother and sister-in-law live there. My brother's children are married to Mexicans. My brother's wife is Mexican. So there's
Wow.
plenty of contacts, and we've got friends all over Mexico, but also we've actually developed a great set of relationships with folks from Colombia and other parts of Latin America. So there's quite a bit of staying in touch with the folks in Latin America.
Qué guay, qué genial.
Claro.
Muy bien. Well, that's awesome.
The next episode, we'll do this in Spanish, Jay.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, if I would have known that earlier, maybe we could have tried to do this one in Spanish, because I'm actually in Madrid.
Oh, wow.
I've lived in Spain for a few years. So my Spanish level isn't bilingual like yours, but it's not bad. As you said, everybody's going to know you probably from your time in Verra as the CEO there. You'd said you left over the summer. What have you been up to since then?
Well, I took the summer off. I had a great summer, and I took a long vacation with my family. I kind of enjoyed the summer here in Washington, D.C. And then I was able to join a really interesting trip organized by President Duque from Colombia in the Amazon, who brought together a bunch of investors and multilateral development banks, philanthropies, NGOs, carboners like me, to talk about how we can try to, effectively save the Amazon and protect that ecosystem. That was really interesting. But then I also went backpacking with two good friends of mine out in Wyoming, which was just very wonderful. So I kind of just wanted to dial back and reflect and think about things. And so you had a great summer. And now I'm trying to dip my feet back into, what I want to do when I grow up.
Yeah, exactly. You always have time to figure that out, but nothing will clear your mind a little bit like taking long hikes in the wilderness. So that's a good choice. I'm a bit envious that you're out there able to do that, to be honest. And so stepping down from Verra after a very, very long tenure there, I'm sure that was a very big decision for you. And can you go into what prompted you to decide this?
Yeah, so it was a long time, as I thought back about my tenure at different companies and places. It had usually been about a 5 to 6 year stint. And when I first started the job at Verra, I honestly thought that, again, it was a 5-6 year job. Remember, the year was 2008. President Obama had just been elected. I was convinced we were going to have cap and trade in the US. Eventually, the Europeans were going to tighten the screws. Australia, China would come along. And I thought that the world would, climate change and greenhouse gases would be regulated throughout the world pretty soon. And I thought that the opportunity to work at Verra, which is then the Voluntary Carbon Standard Association, was a great little opportunity to kind of make a contribution and then, turn the lights out, close the door, and be done with it. But then we got to a point where, 5 or 6 years into the job, we found ourselves in quite a bit of the doldrums, if you will, where the market was going down. And we built something, pretty cool. And I didn't feel like it was the right time to leave because I thought that, the entire sector was vulnerable. And clearly we didn't have cap and trade, and climate change wasn't being regulated around the world. And that was the time, when the Paris Agreement came around, I thought, oh, this is great, right? So now we're looking at bottom-up solutions instead of a top-down approach, which was kind of the framework of the Kyoto Protocol. So I thought, well, this actually could now be really interesting. This market could actually grow. And sure enough, before I knew it, the market was back and there was a lot of activity and it got really, really interesting. And so kind of, in the last year or so, I've been thinking, okay, I've been able to ride this wave. I've been able to make a significant contribution, but it is time to let other people take it to the next level. And the team at Verra, I'm, very confident that they'll do a great job and they are doing a good job. So, I felt it was time for me to move on. There's other things. It's a growing market. There's growing opportunities. And I thought that there's probably some other things that I could be doing and contributing to the effort and letting the good folks at Verra run with kind of what they're doing already.
The winds of change, you felt them. So our company is very deeply involved in the voluntary carbon market. That's part of why we have this podcast. And so naturally, we're always reading what's going on in the world of climate change, climate finance, and the carbon markets. I would say that the majority of our listeners are also pretty well educated in the carbon market space and are probably likely up to speed on a lot of what's been happening this year. However, I do want to kind of set the set the stage for the audience. So I'll provide a bit of a brief overview of what's been going on in the VCM, which, of course, you're familiar with all of this. But basically, since the start of 2023, there have been numerous scientific reports and articles released stating that the VCM is broken, that most carbon credits on the market are worthless in the sense that they're not actually avoiding or preventing carbon emissions, that buyers are greenwashing their activity by purchasing offsets, and essentially that the system is not fit for purpose. Needless to say, it's not been a great year for the VCM, and carbon markets have definitely been taking blow after blow throughout 2023. So as somebody who's been at the center of the VCM for many, many years, I'm curious, what is your take on all of this?
Yeah, that's kind of the $1 million question, right? And I get that asked all the time. And my answer is kind of evolving as I think more about it. But I mean, let me just say the first thing, that scrutiny is good, right? Scrutinizing projects and the impacts they're having is good. And I think we actually have, and we may be late to the game here, but there are now a couple of really important initiatives that are out there that are providing, hopefully will provide a much stronger foundation for the market. And of course, I'm talking about the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, which will essentially look at and set a minimum threshold of performance that credits have to meet. So, one of the limitations or the challenges that we have in the market is that you have different certification programs. So a buyer or anybody, looking at the market from the outside has a hard time understanding, well, how do I know that these are equivalent that they're really generating an emission reduction? So I think the ICVCM is really, really important, and will do a job of trying to bring more coherence to the market. Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side, on the demand side, you've got the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, which is about the kind of claims that companies are doing. And the kind of, on the claim side, I have maybe a sharper edge on that, because I think it's unfortunate that companies that have been taking climate action have been called out for, greenwashing. These companies have stepped up and they've done something. So I think we've spent way too much time instilling fear and fear mongering amongst those companies that were actually doing something positive. Now, was it perfect? No. And we now know that companies need to be decarbonizing, and we should, make sure that we're encouraging and basically getting companies to decarbonize first and offset their residual emissions. But the truth is that, we're late to the game. What I mean, we should have had these systems in place, 5 years ago, but we didn't. It was a small market. We didn't really appreciate how big it was going to be. But fortunately, we do have these things in place now, and I think that's good. I think the other thing is that this sector's still fairly young. I mean, we're just starting to grapple with how we account for greenhouse gas emissions and have emission reductions and the whole baseline issue. So, the idea that we can go back and kind of look back and say that something was bad in the past, I think is very dangerous, because in the end of the day, we need to be careful that we're not conflating things. So what I mean here is that what you have, which are the results from projects, are the results that are coming from a set of rules and procedures that have been developed through essentially regulatory grade procedures, right? These are the rules that greenhouse gas crediting programs have. This is what Verra does. This is what Gold Standard does. This is what the Climate Action Reserve does. And so they gathered expert input. They, do a stakeholder consultation, pull together all the results and come up with a set of rules. And that is very different than the outcomes or the results of individual analyses that may reflect individual preferences, but may be tainted by individual biases. So I think that what I see happening now is that we're kind of conflating the two. And so there's one study that says, it's X number of projects are no good. Well, that study reflects the individual preferences of that particular research group or that particular entity. But it's very different than the process that's followed to arrive at a result, at an outcome, at a set of numbers or greenhouse gas emission reductions or credits that are issued. And I think that by conflating the two or equating them, we risk losing the process. And when we lose trust in the process, we can throw the whole thing out the window. So I guess, one thing I'd say is that we need to identify or treat the different elements for what they are. We should understand that the outcomes from projects follow a set of procedures that have been developed through a thorough process, And we need to trust that process, and we need to trust the outcomes of that process. Now, if there are outcomes that don't make sense to some people, that should be brought into the process so that we can improve it over time. Double entry bookkeeping was around in the days of the Greeks and the Romans, but it wasn't codified until 1494 when an enterprising monk put it on paper. Now, I'm not suggesting we take 1,500 years to sort out carbon, but I think it's important that we consider that this is an evolution. It's a critically important part of how we actually develop and survive in this world. So I think we need to be careful about kind of being too quick to judge. And we should treat the analyses as useful input, but again, we should go back to the process, because I think that's what's going to be able to stand the test of time.
I appreciate that perspective. I think that was very clear. And so I guess if we go back to the process, you referenced two groups, ICVCM and VCMI, that are now stepping in and really putting their fingerprints on the market as a whole. And so do you think that these groups are on the right path with the work that they're doing?
Yes, I do. I was on the ICVCM board. I represented the supply side of the market. I was a non-voting member. And I think one of the things that I think was particularly useful, at least from my experience there, was that we had good debates and we had good, strong arguments. And what the ICVCM has done in the end of the day is again, create a regulatory-like process to assess greenhouse gas programs. And that is really important. I haven't been this close to the VCMI, but I understand it's kind of followed a very similar process. I may not agree with everything that they come out with, but I trust the process. And I think that's important. Again, back to the point about projects, right? If you and I, if you take all your audience, the people listening on this call, who presumably kind of know about carbon markets, if we each evaluate 10 different projects, I bet you that we will all come up with different answers and different scoring systems for these projects. So again, we have to be able to trust the process that's followed in order to come up with the results. And again, use any inputs as inputs to, as information to improve the process.
Yeah. And you said that a little bit earlier, and I totally agree that discourse in these situations and in most situations can be and should be quite positive if everybody at least have similar goals in mind with what they're doing. There's no problem with having arguments and debating over certain points, but as long as we're moving in the general same direction, that's just an inevitable part of the process that ideally will strengthen the result or the product. So I'm with you there. And I think that more of that is not a bad thing as long as it's done in, the sense of integrity and the sense of creating a real, tangible end result.
Yeah. Sorry. Let me just say one thing. I think that you made a really good point about what we're trying to achieve here. And I think what I find interesting and compelling about this market is that ultimately it's about keeping corporates accountable for their greenhouse gas emissions, right? And I think with that lens, I think we need to be applying it so that we're actually achieving that goal. Instead of, for example, being so obsessed about or equating, different outcomes with the results that come from a process. So I think that it's really important to keep in mind what we're trying to achieve and how we're going about it.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. This next question is obviously a very wide-ranging. Obviously, we just touched on the two meta groups that are working on the VCM, but what are some other things in your mind that can be done to improve the VCM? Or what are some things that you see that are happening right now that are helping in that besides the ICVCM and VCMI?
Yeah, so a couple of things. The one thing is I think we have to simplify things. We have created a system that is way too complicated, way too costly, takes way too much time, and simply won't scale. The fact that there are hundreds of projects waiting to be certified, I think speaks to the need and the desire to achieve some impact, but also highlights the fact that we've created a system that doesn't really work. And I think in many ways, the system we've created, which is this very lengthy, heavy process that has to create essentially a 100-page PhD level document, full of fancy justifications that then has to be reviewed by an auditor. And then it has to be reviewed by the greenhouse gas programs because we don't trust the system, is incredibly complicated and costly, but ultimately disenfranchises, in many cases, the very communities who we're trying to support, especially when you look at natural climate solutions. So, a community in the Amazon can't prepare a 100-page project description. It's too complicated. So we need to think about how we simplify things. And I think one thing that we also need to consider is, and it gets back to my previous point, I think we need to think about what we're trying to achieve. Right now, it all starts and ends with a ton. And this is a legacy from the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, where we needed to find a ton to offset an emission from a corporate footprint. And I think that was fine, but I think we're now starting to see the market in very different terms. And I actually don't believe that that's a very compelling narrative. What motivated me to kind of enter the carbon markets in particular was that you could link private sector efforts and constructs with environmental action and sustainable development. And so what I found compelling is how you actually deliver this environmental sustainable benefit using the private sector. And ultimately, where that crystallizes to me is if we can start to transform sectors of the economy. And I think that's how many people are starting to think about carbon. It's not just about finding a ton. It's more about what are we trying to achieve in the macro sense. And I think if we can create a more compelling narrative, which in my mind ought to look something like transforming sectors of the economy, that makes for a different way of how we can actually consider additionality, for example. And I'll get into that in a second, but let me give you a story of something which I found very sobering. When I was at EcoSecurities, I ran a joint venture that developed a number of landfill gas projects, and this was called EcoMethane. We had a great offering. We had a lot of projects. And I was speaking to one of my colleagues from EcoMethane the other day, and they were the ones, so at EcoSecurities, who developed the carbon side of it. The company, our partner Biogas, put the pipes in the ground. And I asked my colleague, so how are those projects doing? He said, well, a number of them are mothballed. And this was really sad news. And I was like, mothballed? Yeah, well, the carbon finance ran out and nobody's paying for it. So we're like selling the assets and they're not really operational anymore. And that to me was really sad because what did we achieve? Yes. Did we reduce emissions for a while and allow a company operating under the ETS to achieve its target? Yeah. Okay. That was good. But we didn't transform the sector. And so what I think we need to be thinking about for carbon is how do we actually use carbon finance as a transitional tool to transform sectors of the economy? And I think this asks a broader question, right? You need to think about how do you introduce new technologies that have an economic rationale on their own so that they can kind of operate on their own once you give an initial hump, which you can do with carbon finance. But there's some projects like the methane capture ones, which may not have an economic rationale in the long term. And so you probably need to get governments involved. And so that's where I actually think that we need to rethink the whole concept of additionality. I think the project by project approach doesn't work for the reasons I mentioned before. It's too costly, too cumbersome, too complicated. And we need to create positive list approaches that are set to the appropriate benchmark for the industry or the sector that we're trying to affect. And there's some great research I'm starting to get into. I actually want to do more in terms of thinking about how you actually introduce new practices and new technologies to sectors so that you get them to the tipping point, and then you can take the foot off the pedal and let it operate on its own. But right now with carbon, and I was in the room when we made this decision where we said, well, the maximum market penetration is 5%. And that was really because we were scared to death of crediting something that was not additional. Well, if we're really trying to change sectors, we need to have the appropriate number that identifies what the proper tipping point is for the particular sector. And so we need some research to be done on that. But if we had positive list approaches that had that across the board, you could then see carbon finance flowing at scale. You could see it not get stuck in the registration process, and you'd have a bigger impact and a broader mission, which I think would be really important.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to digest that a little bit once we hang up this call, because I think that that's a good macro view of looking at it in the pivot itself. Inside of the VCM, there are a few key players. One of the most crucial are the registries. So David, obviously I couldn't be speaking with a better person when I start to talk about the registries, as we know that you're the former head of Verra, which is the world's largest. Almost everybody knows this. So how do you view the responsibility and the role of registries in the VCM?
Well, super important. And I think that, they, in many ways, are the gatekeepers, and if I reflect on my role at Verra, A lot of people commiserate with me and say, God, it must have been really hard being the target of all these criticisms on the quality of the credits. But the other side of it is at the same time, we were getting criticism and pressure from the developers to kind of improve their projects. So it's a tough job because you're stuck in the middle. And in many ways, going back to the systems and the procedures, one of our board members, Mark Stewart, would joke that the job of Verra and standard setting organizations is to make rules that nobody loves, but everybody can live with. And I think to a certain extent, that's true. It's a hard position because you have to balance out and you have to always make sure that you are trying to be as practical as you can. So used to think that, if the rules set out by the registries or the greenhouse gas programs, if the private sector were cheering them on, then clearly they were too weak. But if the NGOs, the very green NGOs were cheering, then they were probably impossible to implement. So you have to find a middle ground, and it's a hard place to sit. And it's crucially important because ultimately, again, it's process and results that matter. And you want to see what, the lens that I brought to it when I was at Verra. And there were numerous cases where this happened, right? Where I had a decision to make, and it was like either a financial decision or an integrity decision. And I always sided with integrity, and I'm very proud of that. But I think that that's a really important role of this registry. So I think one thing that is missed is that they should not be making profit. And I think that is really important. And so the profit motive should not be part of the lens of how they operate, because I think that ends up undercutting quality. And perhaps the best decision on that was the renewable energy decision that we made to stop crediting renewable energy in 2019, which is probably the worst, quote unquote, business decision we'd ever made, but it's the right one for the environment.
I'm glad you went there because you literally just teed us up for the next question that I had, which I'm sure you've heard this question a million times as somebody who's, as you said, sat in the middle. And it is, without a doubt, always very difficult to be in the middle of any system. But registries make their earning by issuing credits. So basic arithmetic shows that the more credits equals more money for the registries. And so do you think this simple fact puts the business at odds with ensuring that credits that do eventually hit the market are of high quality?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, and I get it. I think that optically, this is a problem. People see this and say, well, yeah, you're just incentivized to, issue as many credits as you can. Like I said, I do think much of it depends on the leadership and the focus. And one thing I always told my staff is like, look, we should look forward to the day when the program isn't needed anymore. But I get it. I don't think it's as big of a problem as it's made out to be, but I just do think that's important. And I think that there's some things that can be done to address it. The highest level, is there a better solution? If there were a foundation or someone said, look, I'm going to basically bankroll this, forever or for as long as we need to, then that would be great. But, foundations, if you've ever been through the foundation process, the first thing they ask you is like, okay, so what's your process? What's your plan to become independent of us, right? As always. So foundations, at least I found, to be honest, I've not explored this more recently, but I found that they were always wanting to get to a point where you actually cut the cord. In fact, one of the earliest grants that we got at the VCSA was from a foundation. And that was one of the key questions, like, how are you going to cut the umbilical cord? And we said, we're going to charge fees. So unless someone was willing to walk in with a big check and say, we'll pay for this forever, great, we can do that. But until then, what I think we can do is we can minimize the impact. So I was talking about additionality before, and I know you said you'd want to go away and digest this, but let me just put out one concept here, which I think would be really powerful. Right now, the issue is, comes to a head when Verra or Gold Standard is being asked to approve a project. And you're asked to assess the justifications that are in this 100-page document, which are all fancy and, very well thought out. Well, if we change the additionality setup so that it's more of a positive list approach, and we identify the sectors that we know could use carbon finance that can be transformed once you reach a tipping point, well, then that reduces the burden on the greenhouse gas programs to actually make that crucial decision, right? And if we look at it at a macro scale, that then kind of eliminates that big concern that people have. It would also reduce the dependency on auditors, on the VVBs, who also have a conflict of interest, right? Because all of a sudden their role isn't necessarily to check these 100-page documents, but it becomes more about looking and making sure that the verification part of it sends up. And that's harder to gain, right? That's data. I mean, that's especially now with all the new innovations related to satellite imagery and monitors and sensors, right? You can't really, it's much harder to manipulate, especially if you kind of go to systems like, the blockchain world, where you have smart contracts that are immediately transacting and making decisions based on data that's feeding into the system. So what I think you can do is, unless someone comes in and, writes a big check to the greenhouse gas funding programs, I think you can actually minimize the conflict of interest so that it's not as big of an issue.
David, I'm going to have you back on for another episode where we can just dive in exclusively to these ideas that you're throwing out, because I appreciate this.
Yeah.
This is good food for thought. This is definitely the type of thing that needs to be bounced around a bit.
Well, good. I'm glad I'm provoking some ideas and some thinking here.
Yeah, you most definitely are. If we circle back to the VCM, of course, one of the other key players in the game are the project developers. And I'm sure without a doubt you read the recent article in the New Yorker about South Pole and the Kariba Red Plus project in Zimbabwe. The article levels responsibility at the feet of the project developers South Pole and Stephen Wenzel in Zimbabwe, but it does also reference the role Verra played in the project. Once more, I ask, what's your take on this, assuming you've read the article?
Yes, no, of course. Well, I can speak only to Verra for what our role was. And I think, going back again to process and procedure, that's what we did. We followed the procedure that was kind of in the rule book. Now, and that was what we were supposed to do. So we did. Now, could the procedure have been better? Yes, absolutely. And, we are constantly this never-ending search for perfection when you're thinking about kind of these procedures and these projects. So I think we need to be conscious of how we can improve those rules and the requirements. And there are lessons learned for sure. If we're going to let this market have an impact on climate, I think we need to be conscious of continuous improvement and move on. Because we could dwell on this forever and spend all of our time. Whereas what I think we need to do is, again, take the lesson, apply it, and improve the system and move on.
Yeah, I think about that in my own daily life, right? We create systems for our daily lives, the things we want to accomplish in a day, the way we want to live our lives, et cetera. And that is never perfect ever. We're constantly improving as things change. So I'm with you in the sense that it's always good to assess what's happening in the current, but it's good to take that information and hopefully improve going into tomorrow. You can apply this to anything in our lives, I would say, but
yeah, for sure.
So going into tomorrow, there is clearly a lot of change happening in the VCM. As somebody who has been very much in the know for a really long time, if you look into your crystal ball, David, what are your predictions for the future?
The crystal ball question, huh?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you this.
Let me ask also, David, I guess I could just ask, do you still believe that the VCM can play a key role in moving very, very much needed climate finance to where it needs to go, which is essentially everywhere in the world, and help the world reach its net zero goals?
So short answer, yes. And I'll give you, one way to answer your question is, what am I doing now? So I'm still in the carbon markets, and I still passionately believe that they can do a lot of good. I think there's some homework that we need to do to make them better. But yes, I think that carbon markets are a great complementary tool to internal reductions. And I think they're a great tool because they can move finance fast to where it's needed. They're very efficient, and they deliver development benefits in some ways much better than other models have. I mean, if you think about how many stories have we heard of development projects that fall apart because, the whims of the host country changes. I mean, carbon has a real potential for, again, going back to my point about additionality and how we should be thinking about the carbon markets, to transform sectors of the economy if we're able to hold corporates accountable, right? So which will then drive a lot of finance to, pretty cool stuff. And the truth is that decarbonizing is really hard.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you limit the scope to companies with SBTs, those companies are going to find soon enough how hard it is to decarbonize, especially as we move down the list of options, which will get increasingly more costly and complicated. So I'd like to think of the example of a company that invested in a new boiler 10 years ago. Well, that boiler has 20 years to go. Ideally, should you retire today? Yes. Is the chief financial officer going to buy that argument? No. But maybe you can actually get that company to commit to retiring that boiler early, maybe 5 years early, and maybe use offsets in between. That's a good solution for the environment. So I think the carbon markets have a real logic. I think if you think about where we're going, I'd like to come back to the carbon budget, right? The carbon budget is about 50 gigatons. It's kind of what we have left before we hit 1.5 degrees. And that's where, we see catastrophic stuff happening if you don't consider what's happening already bad enough. I mean, just yesterday, talk about Latin America. I used to spend my days when I was a kid, a lot of vacations would go to Acapulco. And the place has been devastated by Otis, which turned out to be a Hurricane 5 direct hit on Acapulco. Massive, massive destruction of property and infrastructure. Fortunately, apparently not that many casualties. But still, this is pretty bad. And so again, back 50 gigatons to emit. 500 gigatons. We emit about 60 a year. Mm-hmm. So you can do the math, but there's not much time left.
No,
so
sir.
As we starting to approach that, it's becoming imperative that we keep emissions from going into the atmosphere. And that's about avoidance, right? We need to make sure that we don't make the problem any worse, which by then, if we do reach the land of net zero, which in 2050 means we'll be removing the equivalent number of residual emissions from the atmosphere, that's going to be at 6 gigatons, roughly, 10% of what we emit today.
Yep.
We've got like a fraction of that in the market today. So we need to build that up over time. So carbon markets are a great way to keep the problem from getting worse. And they're a great way to invest in those long-term technologies and approaches that are going to get us the removals we need. So I think that there's a fundamental logic to the market. I know that we're in a bit of a retrench mode and kind of taken a lot of hits in the last year, but I think it will come back, especially as people start to realize how difficult this is and how important it is that we tackle the problem.
Do you see the eventual possibility of the merging between the VCM and the Article 6 carbon market, which is maybe 2-3 years away? And we don't have to set that up because I think most of our listeners are familiar with what the Article 6 carbon market is, and I've actually had conversations in the past. But this is kind of a thing that we talk about a lot inside of Gordian is like, how are these two going to merge? And so what's your take on maybe a potential merger of them? Or do you think that the two markets will remain separate and function independently?
So I actually think the markets have already merged. And people have this think that, at some point, we're all going to look up in the sky and there's going to be this big man that says, oh, by the way, the voluntary market and the articles and the compliance markets have now merged and now we're in a different world. It's kind of happened already. I mean, Article 6 already allows under Article 6.2 for countries to use whatever framework they decide. Now, they will probably use one of the existing greenhouse gas programs, but they might choose something else. And it's all voluntary. You don't have to do transactions under Article 6. It just happens that they're blessed by the UN. But again, if you're looking at an Article 6.2 transaction, that's blessed by the country. So I actually think that this separation between, voluntary and compliance markets doesn't really make much sense. And I'm actually going to go back to a comment my wife told me the other day. It was the summer and we were talking and I was explaining, the voluntary market and the compliance markets. And she looks at me with a quizzical look and she says, honey, why do you call it the voluntary carbon market? And of course, I went into this fantastic explanation that they're different, that blah, blah, blah. And she just had this quizzical look still on her face. She's like, do you realize that the word voluntary makes it sound like it's underfunded, it's unprofessional, and that it's held together by duct tape and strings? And that was it. And I was like, oh my God, she is absolutely right. Because I thought back, it's like, wait a minute, it's a real market. There are real transactions. There's real money. There's real legal agreements. There's real boots on the ground. Let's stop calling it the voluntary carbon market. It is the carbon market. It may be used for different purposes. Maybe it's a corporate who wants to make some sort of claim on the fact that it's using a credit. Maybe it's a corporate making a claim because it's being told to by its government. Or it's a government transaction. But they're used for different reasons. But it's kind of all the same market, maybe just used for different reasons. And there will be different pricing, et cetera. But I think we need to We need to stop using the word voluntary if I want to give credit, or credit to my wife, who I think was a brilliant comment. And we just call it the carbon market. And it just happens to be used for different reasons, for different things.
That is a extremely practical point of view from your wife.
She is practical for sure, and way smarter than me.
Yeah, I love it. And I hope that the listeners chew on that a little bit and wrap their mind around that, because that is very practical. So as we wrap this up, David, and we're talking about the future, but now we're shifting away from the market itself, and let's focus in on you. What's your idea or goals or aspirations for the future when you look at what's coming ahead for you? Or you're going to stay on the path that you're doing, the independent things, or you're going to go back out and hike for 5 more months and kind of disconnect? But what's coming down the pipeline for you, David?
Well, I wish I could go on hike for 5 more months. I probably don't have the financial wherewithal to do that, unfortunately. So I do have to pay the bills. But, for me, I think I'm looking at different options for what I can do here at a high level. One of the things, I mentioned the work on additionality. I'm actually trying to find some funding to get that going, because what I'd like to do with that one is actually work with a number of universities to do some proper research and understand this and look at what behavioral economics has to tell us, what development economics has to tell us, what business economics has to tell us about how we actually can transform sectors of the economy. So hopefully that materializes into something. But there's a couple of things here and there, but kind of at the highest level, I say that what I think we need to do is we need to democratize carbon markets. We need to make them more accessible, and we need to take them out of our ivory tower. How much time and effort have we spent debating the minutia of the projects that are out there? And again, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, because it's about scrutiny and making sure that the process and the rules and the systems work. But in order to make this work at scale, we need to make sure that we make this a practical solution that allows us to ensure the green transition, which is ultimately what we're all trying to achieve.
Absolutely. And I know this is a pivotal moment for you. And so, of course, I wish you all the best in the next steps. And I have faith that, of course, you'll figure it out. We need you in the fight. We need everybody in the fight. So
thank you.
The more skilled, knowledgeable people, the merrier, is what I always believe in. But okay, David, so we always like to close out the episode in the same fashion, which is by leaning into Stoicism. I'm not sure if you are familiar with Stoicism. I'm sure you are, but the once great Stoic philosopher Epictetus said, "What concerns me is not the way things are, but the way people think things are." And so I like to apply this to climate change and climate finance. And I want to ask, what do you think is one thing that must be done to change the way people think about climate change and think about climate finance?
Yeah, so it's a great quote. I think we need to explain and inform and educate people that the carbon markets, I would say carbon finance. I think, climate finance is a bit broad, but I'd say carbon finance is a tool that we can use positively to make an impact on this problem. Right now, people think that these markets are dodgy, that it's full of greenwashing, et cetera. And I think we really need to try to change that mindset. And that's a number of things. That's a lot of homework, right? That's about, in my mind, instituting change, such as you do through the ICBCM and the BCMI. It's about changing the narrative and telling a positive story about what we do. But I think it's also has to do with kind of changing the rules of the game and what we're trying to achieve, which goes back to my point about additionality and bringing in new tools like the remote sensing, the sensors, all that digital MRV, I think is going to be very useful, because it's going to make the data and the outcomes a lot more transparent. And therefore that will bring a lot more trust to the market. So if we can do that, I think we'll be in a position to really see this market grow to what it can do.
I know that's not an easy question to answer, but I think you did a A+ job.
Thank you.
It's a curveball, I like to think, but you did great. And so that's it for us, David. I really appreciate you joining me today. And I, without a doubt, know that some of the ideas that you floated hopefully will get the wheels turning in the heads of some of the listeners. And so I appreciate you contributing that as well. So thanks again. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you had some fun.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was a great interview. Thank you, Jay. A pleasure to be here. Thanks.
And that wraps up another episode. In the time that David and I recorded this conversation, he has been quite busy. In November, he contributed an article to Quantum Commodity Intelligence, sharing his insights on enhancing the incorporation of the existing VCM into the Paris Agreement to combat climate change and facilitate increased resource transfers from the global north to the global south. Additionally, he crafted and shared a visual on LinkedIn, emphasizing the significance of the VCM in steering the world away from depleting the remaining global carbon budget. Links to both of those are in the show notes. I'll be back again in January with Dr. Lambert Schneider, the research coordinator for international climate policy at the Oko Institute in Germany. Having served as a former executive board member of the Clean Development Mechanism, Dr. Schneider has played a vital role in carbon market negotiations and development for many years. Widely recognized as a leading authority on both voluntary and compliance markets, as well as emissions trading, he has contributed significantly to crucial projects involving the Article 6 carbon markets, market mechanisms, methodology development, and various other aspects of the field. Dr. Schneider and I cover a lot of interesting topics related to global carbon markets during our convo, so you do not want to miss out. And now, time for a little housekeeping. Please make sure to subscribe and leave a review for us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you listen on Spotify, hit the little bell so you get reminders when new episodes release. In addition to Untangling Climate Finance, we record weekly audio versions of our newsletter, Sliced, so there is always a steady stream of new content and thought pieces coming from our channel and team. And if you leave a review, I'll read it at the top of an episode, just like I did this time. And as always, if you want to connect, you can shoot me an email at jtipton@gordian.strategies.com. A link to my email address is in the show notes. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. I sincerely appreciate you listening, and have a happy holidays. This podcast is produced by Gordian Strategies.